Now, Rihaz Bashir, who is a sixth form student, has a question. Mr. Bashir.
In the light of the banning of the 17 anti-apartheid organisations, is the British government justified in its opposition of economic sanctions against South Africa in the face of calls for sanctions by black South African leaders such as Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu and by most of the EEC?
Russell Johnston.
I think not. I mean, I must say, a person driven reluctantly towards the idea of sanctions, mainly because I do think that it is exceedingly difficult and requires a high level of complicated agreement to make sanctions operate effectively. But one wonders now, and more wonders, what on earth the Western world can do to make the South African government alter its position. And certainly the Eminent Persons Group, containing incidentally Tony Barber, former Conservative Chancellor, was quite clear about that. The sanctions that they talked about were very limited and moderate. But I'm very depressed, I must say, at the most recent news from South Africa, when you consider that what President Botha has done essentially is to bring these restrictions in to satisfy the electors in two small Transvaal towns where there's going to be by-elections. And that really is quite disgraceful.
Shirley Goodwin.
I'm still amazed that we should still be so surprised when a repressive regime like the one that we've seen in South Africa should do exactly what it's just done, which is respond to its hardliners who, of course, are seeking to protect their power base. We see it everywhere. We see it in the Soviet Union, where perestroika and glasnost is, Gorbachev is trying to push those through. He's getting reactions from his hardliners. Wherever you've got repression, you've got this kind of thing going on. So really, why are we surprised? To answer the question, though, I think the only way is for all of us, each in our own ways, and they will be different for different groups, political, professional and personal, to continue to protest internationally and nationally, using whatever means those particular groups find appropriate for them. I personally believe sanctions should be used as well.
Mr. Portillo?
Well, I very much agree with Russell that what has happened is, I think he said disappointing. I mean, I think it's really appalling what has happened in the last couple of days. The question then remains, would sanctions be the way to bring about change? I'm not convinced of that at all. I mean, sanctions might work in destroying the South African economy, or they might not work. But even if they did work in destroying the South African economy, what would the effect be on the black people living in South Africa? And in any case, what makes us think that that would lead us to a political solution in which everybody participated in government? I think it might lead to much greater bloodshed. It might, in a way, salve our consciences. But I find it very hard to see how sanctions lead to majority rule in South Africa, which is the ambition of everybody. So even though this further deterioration has occurred, I still don't find it a convincing argument for sanctions.
Mr. Beecher.
I don't think it is a sufficient answer simply to say that it is terrible what's happened and we must protest and use whatever influence we can. The fact is that has been, in fact, the government's stance. And we have seen the situation go from bad to worse. Presumably every means of pressure has been brought to bear, and it has simply led to increased repression. Mrs. Thatcher's response to this was that it was a major setback. One wonders what has to happen before it is a crisis. We have had the South Africa invading neighbouring states. We've recently seen evidence of them detaining and torturing children. We've seen their detention and killing of black leaders like Steve Biko. I mean, at what point are we finally going to say, in the Western community of nations, enough is enough? And I do think we have, not just because of this, but because of the whole record. I think the case for sanctions is overwhelming.
What sanctions would you apply?
Well, can I just say this, because there's one answer which has been used against it, which I think one should reply to, namely that black people themselves don't want it, and it would cause problems for black people, might cause unemployment, and that they will carry much of the burden. The answer to that is they are themselves already carrying most of the burden. And it is already, there is evidence that a majority, an increasing majority of blacks and black leaders are now calling for sanctions themselves. The fact is there is no alternative. In answer to your question, Robin, what kind of sanctions? Clearly, it does mean a list of economic sanctions in order to exert influence. Even the present government was prepared to take sanctions, economic sanctions, against Poland. If they're prepared to do that against Poland, why not against South Africa?
But I'd like to continue on this question of what sanctions, because there's general agreement around the table on the evil of apartheid. But
the main one is oil. The main one is oil.
Yes, the main one is oil, but South Africa is a country with a long coastline, unlike Poland. How do you stop things getting into South Africa?
Well, they have...
If you say, right, we say we won't do this, we won't do that, won't send them that, no oil, no aeroplanes, but the Japanese going to bear that?
Well, I think the Japanese would find it very difficult to get major oil tankers into South Africa if you had an international patrol. It has to be done internationally, I quite agree. But if the EEC does represent anything, if the UN has any force for good, surely this is an instance where it ought to act, and it could act. We all know that those bodies could take that action and enforce it and make it effective if they really chose to.
Do you think that is so, Mr. Bortillo?
I'm still trying to work out whether Michael Meacher is saying that we should do this in order to express our disapproval, or whether he believes it's going to lead to a change of government and to majority rule. And it is that latter point that I find so difficult to glean from what he said or from what anybody else has said. How is it that applying sanctions then leads by stages to the appointment of a majority rule government? I can see that it might lead to one of two things: either South Africa getting by without goods from abroad, which is a possibility, or to economic chaos and bloodshed and difficulty and greater hardship. I don't think you can just say, oh, well, look, people are having a terrible life already, so it doesn't matter making it much worse. I want to know if that actually means that you're going to get a majority rule government. And I think if it doesn't mean that, then we've got a lot of explaining to do to make sure that we're not just saying we want to salve our consciences.
Mr. Riaz-Bashir, who asked the question, what do you say to what you've heard?
Well, I think that the fact that it is the black leaders of South Africa who are calling for sanctions means that obviously that the British government's argument is a nonsense, that they are trying to protect the interests of the black people.
What about Chief Buthelezi?
Chief Buthelezi is what you would call one of... He is simply a follower of the government. He will do whatever the government wants him to.
You think he's an Uncle Tom, do you?
I think so.
Yeah.
Can I ask, why does Mr. Meacher and other people who support the idea of sanctions, why do they always mention the ANC and the atrocities that have occurred from the government's point of view towards people in the ANC, but they never mention the atrocities that the ANC have performed, the people who are asking for sanctions, unlike the majority party in Carter and Chief Buthelezi, who are the majority of black South Africans, who are saying quite openly they are against sanctions being imposed?
Mr. Meacher.
The fact is, of course, one opposes violence from whomsoever it comes. And the ANC, contrary to the opinion of many people in this country, was, until recently, a pacifist or a peace organisation that certainly did not engage in terrorist activity. The fact is they have been driven increasingly by finding, ever since Sharpeville, ever since Soweto, and the killing of not just hundreds but thousands of black people, the detaining and torturing of thousands of people, that there is no other way. One may regret it, and certainly one doesn't condone it. But if in that situation they feel there is no alternative, I don't believe that we have a right simply to wash our hands and walk away.
Any more questions on this? Yes.
But surely the circumstances have changed now. Peaceful opposition has been made unlawful. What other way do the